Welcome to the Bird's Eye View. This series is not meant to be a political or cultural commentary, nor is it a nitpick or comprehensive review. What we will be doing is diving into entertainment to try to understand its message, how well it accomplishes this, what we can learn from it, and how it might be improved. So let's look into it. In this video essay, we're going to be looking into She-Hulk. Now, this has been quite a controversial outing for Marvel in this case on the small screen. However, despite all of the debates back and forth, not many people have discussed what is the show actually about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What is She-Hulk really trying to say? What is the point of She-Hulk? First, we'll take a look at the themes, then we'll take a look at the struggles and the conflicts that are central to the core plot, and then we'll go to the moral or the outcome, the message that it gets to at the end. Over and over again, this show emphasizes the themes of being another, on the outside, of duality, being objectified as one who is perceived. Jennifer is both a lawyer on the inside in that kind of group, and a woman also on the outside in this boys' world, in this men's world. Then, due to her accident, she becomes a Hulk. But the twist in her case is that she remains reasonable and in control, while still having all the constant temptation of her Hulk rage.
So I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you. So all of this just feels like projecting a lot of shit onto me.
Again, putting her exactly in the center, or tossed between two sides, where she's both a Hulk, feeling all of the issues, all the conflicts internally that comes with being a Hulk, while at the same time being cognizant that she's struggling with these things. And this type of core theme is echoed throughout the rest of the plot. But while this is not only an internal struggle, it is also an external one, in which multiple different sides or different angles of who she is defined by others, by the perception that they force upon her. Even her name itself was something that she did not give herself. So we see how this external pressure forces her to choose to only present a certain side that the public or those who are watching her would prefer to see. So another great example of this is when we see her being hired.
We hired her.
This way, please. We are the first top-tier law firm to launch an entire division dedicated to superhuman law.
God, is this why they hired me? Okay, this sucks. I am totally qualified, but now everyone around here is always going to think this is the only reason I got the job. It's so unfair.
Now she's hired in this affirmative action way that forces her into the narrow role of expecting to only present as She-Hulk and not Jennifer, whereas originally she had wanted to be fully Jennifer and work as a lawyer trying cases as Jennifer solely, letting the alter ego of She-Hulk basically be cast aside and not used at all. So that being said, what are the core themes of She-Hulk? The core themes are one of internal integration, the struggle to bring together different parts of yourself to be a whole person, and not just rejecting one or the other, but trying to struggle to bring them together in a whole piece. But the second part is that external struggle with feeling defined by other people, by how they see you and how they want to see you, being forced by public perception, like how she's named by the press and not by her own accord, or simply by force of money itself, having to be hired with his job when she's out of work, only to present as She-Hulk when she wanted to be something more. So it's this external struggle of being defined by others and this internal struggle of trying to integrate both and not simply a shunning one part, but instead being a whole person. And what's more, being accepted for that wholeness. Despite there being a variety of villains in this show, the conflict rather seems to focus on self versus society. She-Hulk's struggle is more one of questioning, grappling with, and being forced to conform to other people's expectations. So while on paper, there may seem to be a villain of the week or several villains that come back to She-Hulk and present a threat later on, still the same core remains, and the reason I bring this up is in regards to intelligentsia. On paper, once again, not to overuse the term, but that seems to be the overarching villain, intelligentsia. However, this perfectly goes to what I'm talking about when it comes to self versus society. Intelligentsia on paper, and we'll get to the quality in the execution later on, but on paper does an excellent job of presenting us with a concrete foil to represent society or the expectations that certain people are judged by, in this case She-Hulk. However, not just the expectations overall, but in particular, they represent the negative side or the most bitter, resentful part of the expectations that are put on us and the judgment that we believe are right behind those expectations. That if we don't act a certain way, if we don't make certain choices, if we aren't a certain type of person, then the judgment, the hatred, the negativity will circulate around us like a dark cloud and basically infect other people with the same types of ideas, thereby turning our social circle or even those we've never met against us before we ever even have the opportunity to show them who we really are, or even a more positive aspect of the narrow version that they want to see. This core struggle is shown and mirrored on multiple different levels and different severity. So we have intelligentsia being the most negative aspect, but then we have other aspects that might be more humorous or more absurd. For instance, Titania. We see her ability to use social media in a way to stereotype herself as this narrow version, and we see her internal struggle in the wedding episode with that as well, wanting to shine, wanting to be the biggest, best version of herself, but in so doing, that is a very narrow aspect, a narrow angle of herself. And this further ingrains the cultural message, the societal message of people being judged, particularly women in this case, and superheroes judged in a narrow view, in a narrow way, only being able to be a certain type of person. And She-Hulk even feels that quite literally in the struggle for her trademark. We also see this, for example, when she's trying to work on Tinder matches. So she's on the off-brand Tinder trying to find matches, and she gets none as being Jennifer. However, but when she goes over to being She-Hulk, she gets a lot. This is one more piece of evidence that goes to show the cultural pressures She-Hulk is feeling, Jennifer is feeling, to be only a certain type of person, only a certain aspect of who she really is. However, this struggle or conflict and the themes that surround it ultimately come to a head in the climax, when the, we'll say, intimate tape is shown in front of everyone, and it is revealed that the man she thought might have been someone she could really open up to and show more of her full self, was only doing it for money, attention, and working for someone much more sinister with bad motives in mind. To go back and reference the themes we discussed earlier, this further cements the division between Jennifer and She-Hulk, in this case quite literally, because she is not allowed any longer to turn into She-Hulk. Now we've come to the outcome, the moral, the final message. We come to the season finale, and we see that at first, it seems like it's going to be another Marvel throw everything at the wall and have the twist, Hulk comes back, a lot of extra things thrown in there. However, the difference in She-Hulk's case is that she forcibly chooses to break the fourth wall and take control of her own story. She confronts first the writers, and then eventually she goes straight to the top to Kevin. Rather than focus on the specifics of the climax, I think it's more important to look at a couple choices that the writers made in regards to how they ended it. First, they had her, of course, confront Kevin, go to the top. Another thing that they had happen, though, was they chose to have She-Hulk present as Jennifer. This is a very important part because it shows them, or in this case, and this part is a little fuzzy, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the quality, but she presents as Jennifer, showing that to the public and to the people watching, and also to the show itself, because she then goes back in as Jennifer, that she is not She-Hulk, that that's not really who she is, but the more totality, the larger version of who she is Jennifer. Another interesting choice that they made was that they brought back Matt Murdock, and while they did play it for laughs, the interesting part of bringing him back is that he was the only love interest Jennifer really had that saw her in more of a holistic manner. What do I mean by that? I mean, he saw her not just as She-Hulk, as someone who fought crime and was a big green monster, but instead also as a lawyer. They were able to quip back and forth, and that was a big part of the connection. Now, with this wrap-up of the series, what is the message? Well, due to some of the writing decisions, this question is not as easy as it should be. However, I believe the message ultimately is to actively resist the harmful perceptions that culture, that society, or that people in power place on us. And this show thus far has shown She-Hulk playing inside the system, reluctantly, even complaining at times, yet still going along with the role that she so resented. And while she broke the fourth wall, she's making fun of that, going back and forth, and yet still she continues onward in that same position. Yet the finale, by implication, seems to tell us to confront the world, confront the people that see you as being on the outside and force you into certain roles, who notice you but never really see you. And that it's not just enough to go along with it, but you have to actively go to them or confront the power structures, the system, whatever you want to call it, that's actively putting you in that position. That is the one that's responsible for why you're stuck in this pigeonholed, small, narrow box, this cage that you've been put inside. Furthermore, from there, you then have to go on to make your own story, to write your own narrative, to then become the person that you really believe yourself to be. It's not enough, just in this case, to go to Kevin Feige in this example and to tell him that you've been written wrong and that's not who you really are, but instead you must go the extra mile to write your own story, to present your own climax, your own narrative, your own wrap-up, and to be your own person. I hope this video does a good job of answering the question, what is the point of She-Hulk? In the next video, we're going to discuss the quality of She-Hulk. How good of a job does it do? How does it succeed and how does it fail when it comes to establishing and promoting its message? We'll be asking the question, does She-Hulk make sense? I'll see you then. In this video, we're going to be asking the question, does She-Hulk make sense? What is the quality of She-Hulk? We're going to be looking at how does it succeed in its message and how does it fail. Fundamentally, She-Hulk is about the duality of perception and the nature of being an other. She-Hulk wants to be seen as Jennifer, as a complete person, but this becomes a struggle because of how she's viewed and judged by those around her, especially intelligentsia, which represents the most negative aspect of this. Ultimately, she succeeds, and we're going to be discussing how she does that and how the show does a good job of reinforcing these messages going forward. Now, first we'll talk about how it succeeds. This show does an excellent job of showing, rather than telling, how the world around her objectifies her as She-Hulk, and makes her feel isolated because she's forced to fit just in that narrow scope. For instance, she's hired as a diversity hire, as an affirmative action type thing, in order for her to actually get a job. She's forced, by basically contract, to only present as She-Hulk, thereby forcing her, basically objectifying her in a kind of superhero fashion, to only be a certain area. But also, when it comes to her dating life, she could only find dates as She-Hulk.
Oh, why is that an alert? I'm not proud of this.
Lights, camera, action.
Again, this goes to show how society and how the culture around her forces her into a narrow version of herself. And unlike a lot of other TV shows, movies, etc., which will just preach to you this conflict or the theme or the message, whatever you want to call it, that they're trying to focus on, instead, you do see the struggles up close and personal, very specifically, very concretely, how She-Hulk is mistreated by those around her. It also does a good job of echoing this struggle through multiple different layers of the story. Regardless of if it's big or small, so many of even the side concepts, the side stories, involve ideas of perception. Like, for instance, Titania being on social media, being basically a snake oil salesman that leans into the fears of the public, while also taking away the trademark, not allowing She-Hulk to be able to seen on her own accord as well. We see this even in regards to small things, like the shape-shifting elf, impersonating celebrities to try and con people. We also see the same ideas of perception when she has to look for the underground supersuit maker. So over and over again, we see these concepts of perception being echoed across multiple different layers, multiple different B-plots and examples. And this does a good job of giving us different ideas or just different angles of the same core themes. Another particular bright spot, I thought, was how they did a good job of showing Abomination change from being this rage monster, military type, to being a in touch with himself, mindful yogi guru.
Jennifer Waters.
Mr. Blonsky, I was expecting...
Abomination, right? No, you won't be seeing much of him about. I've completely transformed myself. I'm simply a meal now.
Aside from this being just a fun comedic concept, it's also a good opportunity for She-Hulk to work on integrating her own self, the opposite aspects of her own self, and having to grapple with that, which is something they did try to do in one of the later episodes when they had their support group. While this video is mostly about seeing how well She-Hulk did in promoting its message, I also want to touch on some of the messages overall, meaning some of the ideas at the core. And the reason I say that is because this show really did a good job with a lot of these inventive ideas. I think the idea of a Hulk in therapy is brilliant and really could make for some very hilarious comedic moments. Though at times Matt Murdock did seem to be tacked on, I will say that his addition to it helped a lot in reinforcing the core idea that Jennifer really wanted in a romantic connection, full openness, or someone who really accepted who she was as Jennifer, and not just looking for someone who wanted her to simply be She-Hulk alone. I think a lot of its core themes are very interesting and haven't been touched on much in superhero media, but also the finale is really unique, and when I watched it for the first time, it was genuinely surprising that she would come out and go straight into the Disney Plus section and then confront Kevin Feige, who turns out to be a robot. These are some really unique, cool ideas that had a lot to them. Now for the second part, how it fails to illustrate its point, how it falls short. I'm afraid She-Hulk fails in one of the most fundamental ways any project can fail, by directly contradicting its own message. The message of being objectified, treated as an other, and seen as only a shallow, two-dimensional version of yourself is very compelling, but this show makes the fatal error of treating its character in exactly the same way. Who is Jennifer? We know she's a lawyer who has vaguely stereotypical feminist views and wants a boyfriend, but aside from this caricature, who else is Jennifer truly? If you're coming up blank, it's because they did not do a good job of showing us who she really was. We saw that she was a lawyer, but what were her hobbies? What were the things she was really interested in? Why did she become a lawyer? Why did she have this struggle of feeling objectified and feeling she was on the outside the whole time? Now, I'm not saying that many women don't deal with this, but what in particular made it so hard on her? Every woman, every man, every person might have similar core conflicts to a lot of other people, but they're still unique. The way that they interact with those struggles that are common is what makes them unique. That's the difference. And that's exactly what She-Hulk lacked. It lacked that uniqueness. So this whole time, it is preaching to us in more ways than one, in some ways that I agree with and I think are quite interesting, quite fascinating, and yet it decides to fall short of exactly that idea of seeing people for who they really are, of looking beneath the surface. It doesn't give us a look beneath the surface. It doesn't show us who Jennifer is, and furthermore, it doesn't do the same thing with the other characters. The secondary characters end up being basically glorified caricatures themselves. These one-dimensional, two-dimensional cutouts of the stereotypical lawyer frat boy or the supportive best friend. Not only does this same issue apply to the secondary characters, but the villains themselves also struggle with this, which of course is a common complaint when it comes to Marvel, but on every front, these characters end up coming across as cliched, stereotypical, and one-dimensional. But particularly in regards to this show, that is a fatal flaw. Why? Because this show is about the perception of people. It is about being objectified, being one-dimensional, being otherized, and yet we as the audience don't see. We don't see these people in greater detail. We don't see their bigger struggles. We only see the very surface-level details that the show presents. And that leaves us not really identifying with She-Hulk, or the bonus characters, or the villains. It leaves us feeling on the outside, which is exactly the opposite of what She-Hulk should have done. Thus, the show becomes almost the antithesis of its message, showing every aspect or every person on the political or cultural spectrum the worst version of their bugaboo, whether that is She-Hulk being a cringy feminist or the frat boy lawyer being the worst representation of toxic masculinity. It shows every character being a caricature, a stereotype of their particular group, thereby being the exact opposite, the nemesis to the very meaning, the very message of the show itself. Finally though, the ending, while original and potentially excellent, fell short in several key ways. Most importantly, it hinges on the concept of Jennifer telling her own story. But what even is that story? Like we discussed earlier, we don't really know who she is beneath the surface. So how can it truly tell us, or how can she go on to tell her story when we as the audience don't really know what that story even is? Furthermore, she even has the ability to break the fourth wall and talk directly to the audience themselves, and yet she doesn't even use this ability to talk about her past, or even talk about something that is not incredibly specifically related to the objects of that episode. So she might talk about the episode or the season or the things that have gone on surrounding it, but not about things outside of it. A flashback from her childhood, or some weird grudge that she had. Instead, it focuses almost entirely on the conflicts and the problems inside of this season alone. Because of this, the ending, while it could have been good, it could have been great even, did not truly have the weight it could have had, because we don't know what that story that she needs to tell is. So she confronts these writers, she confronts Kevin to take control of her season, to take control of her own show, saying, this is mine, I want to tell my own story. And yet, what is there to tell? What does she in fact tell in the end? Nothing of true substance. Instead, it stays in this cliched, narrow bubble that she's been in the entire time. Aside from this, from a villain perspective, she never really confronted intelligentsia. Instead, she goes to the writers, who are confirmed, or at least showed to us as being the big bad people, the people who set her up and took away her story and did things on her behalf without her being able to choose. And yet, the writers being the bad guy was not set up earlier. They were not foreshadowed. Aside from knowing that she could break the fourth wall, the writers as an ultimate villain were not something that we knew about ahead of time. The ones we did know about were intelligentsia, not the writers, and not even Kevin. So the first problem with the writers being the villains is that they weren't set up. They were not shown, built up, none of that. Instead, it was this twist at the end that, again, on paper, might have had some good ideas. It could have been pretty funny. It could have been a really good commentary on how you shouldn't allow other people who are above you or those around you to take over your life and make choices for you and define you and to tell you who you really are. That could have been interesting. However, it wasn't set up. It was not made to be a constant through line. But furthermore, because of this, it ended up being a deus ex machina, because the villain we did have, intelligentsia, was never truly confronted. Instead, they were quite literally written out of the story, confronted off-screen, dealt with off-screen, and we never got the conclusion of her actually grappling with the villains that we knew as the audience. So while a lot of the ideas of She-Hulk were quite profound, and at times could have been comedic gold, instead, it served as its own enemy by undermining its own plot, its own themes, and its own message by not allowing the characters to be truly in depth, to allow the audience to see them fully and accept them as people. Instead, they were treated as cliches and props. And then the villains were either stereotypical and underdone, but ultimately ended in nothing. The intelligentsia, we never saw her confront, and when they were confronted, they were off-screen and literally written out by her. And then when she confronted Kevin and the writers, if they were truly the bad guys, they weren't set up, they were not foreshadowed, and so the audience is left longing in more ways than one. This video has been a look at, does She-Hulk make sense? How does it treat its message, themes, and plot? And I hope I've done a good job of answering that. If I was forced to choose between yes or no, I'd probably choose no. It doesn't make sense ultimately because it defeats a lot of its purposes like I discussed. In the next video on She-Hulk, we're going to be taking a look at what we can learn from it. We'll be answering the question, what can we learn from She-Hulk? What can we learn in a writing sense, if we were to write a story? But what can we also learn as far as the message itself? What did the message teach us about being human, about growing as people? Even if it's an incomplete story, I think those are still worthwhile questions. So I'll see you then. Today, we're going to take a look into She-Hulk, and better yet, what we can learn from She-Hulk. First, we'll look at the quality of the writing. Then secondly, we're going to look into the message itself, what we can learn from what it is really trying to say. Then lastly, we're going to take a look at what it says in actuality. Sometimes the intention of a message is different than how it appears in the story itself. First, a quick look at the message itself and the quality before we jump into what we can learn. First, as far as the message goes, She-Hulk is mainly about the idea of the perception of others, taking that and then defining who we are, and not really being able to be our full selves to others, but instead being only a shallow version of what other people perceive. It is about feeling forced into a box, into a role that's not your own, and never truly getting to be yourself with other people, being known by others, but also being able to accept your full self, just as she struggles with being She-Hulk because she still wants to be just Jennifer. Now, secondly, as far as the quality goes, there were a lot of great ideas that were nested inside of She-Hulk. However, there were some very big flaws. First and foremost, it self-contradicts itself. It is so much about perception, seeing people for who they really are in their full, whole selves, and yet we don't really get a chance to see people that way. They don't show us who She-Hulk really is under the surface, who the secondary characters are. Also, the climax really leaves a lot more to be desired because the villains were not truly set up. It sets up intelligentsia, and yet we don't really get to see her confront them. And the people she does end up confronting weren't set up to begin with. If the writers and Kevin were really the bad guys, then they should have been foreshadowed earlier on. Those are some of the big issues with the quality and the overall message. However, what can we learn from these issues and from She-Hulk itself? I think most importantly, the creator should live up to their own expectations. I think a great example of this idea outside of She-Hulk is the movie Cuties. Now, I will not show any footage of that, of course, because I don't want to go into that territory. However, the idea behind that movie, if you watch it, if you listen to the story behind it, was about how objectifying children is wrong, and how the idea that people would use that and think that way, especially children themselves, is a really harmful, terrible idea. Now, that, of course, was nested in exactly the problem, objectifying children. And so it totally contradicts itself, leaving people who watch the movie feeling dirty and everyone hating it because it contradicts itself. And I think you can see that same problem to obviously a much lesser degree in She-Hulk. How it talks so much about perception, about how she feels like no one really wants her as Jennifer, as someone who is more fully herself, who she really thinks of herself as, and yet we don't really understand who Jennifer is outside of the She-Hulk character. So based on this, what can we learn? I think the biggest thing we can learn from She-Hulk is to uphold your own message. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you're writing a story, let's say you're writing it about the fundamental goodness of humanity. If you write a story like that, do not show every character, for instance, to be fundamentally evil, to do terrible evil actions, for people to be backstabbing and killing other people. Why? Because this totally undermines the integral message that you're trying to come across. In so doing, She-Hulk does the exact opposite of that by showing every character in such a two-dimensional light and not giving us more of a three-dimensional view of who they really are as a person. So the first lesson that we can learn from She-Hulk is, from a writing standpoint, you need to uphold your own message. If you're talking about the fundamental goodness of humanity, then show the fundamental goodness. If you're talking about the evils of religion, then show that. That is not to say you can't show the opposite, or make a little balance. She-Hulk could have had two-dimensional characters, but having the main character be two-dimensional, and not showing her in a deeper light, that undercut the whole story. Now, secondly, on a more human level, what can we learn from the message? I think there is this trap in human psychology, where we tend to look at people and think we know all there is based upon how they appear. And I don't just mean how they look, but also how they dress, also how they act, their mannerisms. So the very surface level details, we tend to think, as humans, we already understand who they fundamentally are. And She-Hulk does a good job of commenting on how this makes someone feel, and how this can make someone feel like they're on the outside, that they're not truly understood, that how they appear is all they are. Something that makes She-Hulk unique is that we see the inside of this rather than the outside. I think in many properties, you see the opposite side. It's the main character having to learn about some side character, or even the villain, having to see what it's like to be in their shoes, to understand them more deeply. But in this case, it's the opposite. It's the main character dealing with that struggle of being otherized and being seen as only a small part of who they really are. Based on this idea, there are two different ways to approach the lesson. The first way is from the outside, meaning as the person who isn't otherized, we need to take a look at who people really are under the surface, to withhold our fundamental judgments. It's one thing to have a certain idea about someone based upon their appearance, based upon some surface level details. We have to do that as humans, but instead of making that all they are, from the outside perspective, we should have the patience, the understanding to wait a little bit and try to get to know people more deeply. But from the inside perspective, if we're that person, we need not to just take it. Something we learn from She-Hulk is when she just takes it, just complains, just deals with it, it hurts her. It only makes her life worse and worse over time. And she ends up going through, as far as a mental health standpoint, she goes on somewhat of a spiral until eventually hitting her breaking point on several different levels. Well, first, she kind of broke a little bit when it came to the boyfriend that she had that broke up with her. But the real breaking point was when they had, we'll call it the intimate tape. When the intimate tape was shown at her dinner, that was when she really hit this breaking point. And what do we see there? Well, we see the conflict, the clash of perception of who she is buttoned up, and then seeing who she is behind the scenes. Now, from a quality standpoint, we talked a little bit about that when we discussed the quality. However, from a lesson standpoint, from the message, what can we see here? Well, we can fundamentally see that just sitting back was not good enough. That just letting people judge you or put you in a box was not good enough. The true change in her character and in the show was when she confronted the writers, when she confronted those who put those expectations on her and took charge of her own story. So what can we learn from that? Well, sometimes when we're the ones being judged, it is necessary for us to confront them, to not let people tell your story, but instead to take charge, to tell them it's not okay, and then to boldly tell your own story, regardless of how other people might think or feel, to go forward telling your own story. Now, lastly, what can we learn from what it actually says? That is, from how the message really appears in the show itself. There's the intention and then there's the reality. Well, in reality, there are two different things that we should be learning from the message on a more human level. And the first one is, we need to be willing to accept all of ourselves for who we are. Jennifer has this struggle, and you see this at the beginning, where she rejects She-Hulk completely. She rejects this part of herself, and I don't think the story itself does a good job of commenting on this rejection. Instead, at the end, it somewhat tries to wrap it up in a bow, and I think falsely. It could have taken another episode, or frankly just a rewrite, to try to truly say the fuller story, and that is She-Hulk should have truly accepted that she was Jennifer and She-Hulk, that she was both at the same time, that in order to be seen for all of who she is, she needs to see those aspects in herself first. If others are going to accept you, you must first accept yourself, or that should at the very least come hand in hand. But the last part is, there should have been more emphasis on accepting others as well. Now, I get that she is dealing with not being accepted, but think of the ways that she could have accepted others, that she could have truly learned to see someone, even someone like Matt Murdock, if they had another episode or two where they could focus on that relationship, trying to model that she internalized that lesson herself, that she had to work on seeing others. So if we're going to learn from what it actually says, what's the lesson then? Well, the lesson is, if you want others to see you, you need to accept yourself. If you want others to understand who you are, you have to understand yourself. But furthermore, you have to understand others. It goes hand in hand, understanding yourself and understanding others. And this is a balance that we have to play, where She-Hulk really emphasizes only half of the equation. It's missing the other half. And if it had added more or done some rewrites or tweaks, it could have done a better job of showing this lesson. And it's a lesson we all need to learn. And that is, if you want acceptance, you should accept yourself and accept others. So this has been a look at what we can learn from She-Hulk on a writing level, what it actually intends to say, and then what it should have said, or what it says in actuality, meaning in reality, what is the greater lesson we can take from it and that we can try to apply to our lives. Now that I've gone over that, in the next video, we're going to look at how we could rewrite or tweak the story to make the message far more powerful. So I'll see you then. In this video, we're going to be looking into how to improve She-Hulk. Now that we've looked at some of the ways in which it's failed or has had issues, let's look at how we can actually improve it. The message of She-Hulk is about perception and how it impacts how we view ourselves and how the world views us, and how in turn that changes our lives and changes how we behave. So that being said, the core plot of what I'm going to talk about going forward will be hinged around this message. What I'm going to try and change and mess with is not the small gripes that I had, like some of the humor or the bad CGI. Instead, what I'm going to be working on is how to make the story better for the message, in service of the message, and not just the extra stuff or the stuff that simply is secondary to the message itself. So the message we're trying to propagate going forward is a message of dealing with the perception of others in a positive way, not shutting people out, not letting them see who you really are, while at the same time pushing back on that harmful message and viewing other people in a more accepting, holistic way. So we're trying to take the best parts of that message, but instead fill it out and make it more well-rounded, instead of the somewhat slanted version that She-Hulk had, which I don't think was totally on purpose. I think part of it was just some of the mistakes that it had and undercut the message on the whole. So now that we know the message, some of the problems we had with the show itself was that She-Hulk as a character was not very well thought out, meaning instead of being a three-dimensional, interesting character with motivations we understood, instead She-Hulk was somewhat of a caricature, a stereotype of this high-powered female lawyer. Well, in our rewrite, what we're going to try and do is stick to making She-Hulk a more well-rounded character, trying to show who she really is, trying to fill in those details. The other problem we want to take a look at are the villains. The villains in She-Hulk were a big weak spot, which is true of a lot of Marvel properties. So what we want to do in this is make the villains foreshadowed from the beginning. We want to make the villains the same and something that we build over time, that we foreshadow, unravel, and see as time progresses, rather than be a big surprise at the end. Also, something that goes hand in hand with this is we want the villains, similarly to She-Hulk, to also be something that is fleshed out, also something that is three-dimensional. We want, because of the message being so much about perception and truly understanding people for who they are on a deeper level, we want the villains to also have a similar treatment. So now that the ground rules have been set for how we're going to fix She-Hulk, let's look into some of the big things we're going to change first and foremost. Well, the first big thing I want to say is a lot of the extra characters, they would be gone. We would axe them completely, delete them out, because that extra time that can be freed up should be going to our main character She-Hulk and Intelligentsia. Those two are the ones we should be developing the most, because the hero and the interaction between the hero and their villain are one of the most important aspects to any property, but in particular a Marvel property. The other thing is that any characters that are left after we get rid of all the other superfluous characters, those ones I really want to take a little bit of time with and flush them out, make them three-dimensional so they have something to say, they have something to add and comment on the greater message and story. So that to me would be people like Abomination, he would definitely stay. Nikki, her best friend, should definitely stay. Now we can have Daredevil in for a short time, I don't think that changes too much, but Titania should go, or at least her extra appearances should go. The good attorney, the good male attorney, he should also go. The toxic male attorney should go. The boss can be in there for a short amount of time, but he should also go with any extra scenes, because there's no reason for those scenes to be given to extra characters when they can be given to Jennifer to really dive into what makes her different and unique. So now let's talk about what makes her different and unique, and how we're going to build that into our new series. The number one way we're going to do this is by taking the entire first episode and making that a flashback. It's going to be very similar to a lot of other TV shows and how they set up their main character or just the plot by going back in time. And that's what I want to do with her. I want to go back to high school, and we're going to look at how she was back then, because that's going to be a big commentary to the person that she is today. Now imagine a POV shot, where we see the back of a minivan and her parents in the front seats bringing her to her first day of school. They talk about how pretty she looks, how she's so prepared, and they're really hyping her up for this first day. Then Jennifer goes inside, goes into this, and by the way, this is all shot from a POV, so they don't really see what she looks like. But they wish her good luck, they're taking pictures, being kind of typical parents in that way, and making Jennifer, of course, feel really self-conscious. But they're saying things like, oh, we love your outfit, you're looking great, and a lot of it, I really want to emphasize, is about how she looks. They're talking about how beautiful she is, etc. But we don't see how she looks yet, it's just from the POV. Now this plays into the greater message of perception like we were talking about before. So she walks into the high school, and all from the POV shot, we don't see how she looks. And then we have an outside view. And the outside view is of this tall, beautiful young girl, and it just looks very picturesque, like exactly what you would imagine a young She-Hulk might look like. And then she walks away, shuts it, and we see Jennifer behind her, looking younger, shorter, dorkier, and just very much a stereotype of what you think a young, dorky, nerdy girl might look like. Then, during the course of her first day, she gets bullied by some of the other girls for this board game that she's into. Now, I want this to be some sort of analog, maybe some sort of Marvel version, off-brand version of Dungeons & Dragons, something like that. But she's really into this kind of nerdy board game. She gets made fun of for it, and she comes home crying until she gets a call. And her parents come up and say, oh, someone's on the line for you, and it ends up being Bruce. Bruce then comes over, and they play that Dungeons & Dragons board game together. And from there, we get a montage of her in high school. She gets bullied, but she gets a closer relationship with Bruce. Bruce helps her study math and science, while she helps him study history and English, and they really get a closer connection. Well, during this montage, you see that she also starting to have a crush on this boy in English class. So then, towards the end of this montage, she finally summons up the courage to ask her crush out. and to ask him to come over and play the D&D game or just come over. So she does that. Meanwhile, in the back of class, there's this other nerdy kid who, unlike her, doesn't have any friends, doesn't see anyone, and is just by himself. But you can see that he also starts to have a crush on her. So finally, he summons up the courage to ask her to come to his D&D off-brand thing. Something that the Marvel kids in this universe are into at this time. So he finally asks her, and she says that she can't do it because she invited her crush over to her house. So the crush comes over and they end up studying together. They're both really interested in English and some of the literature stuff, and they both get this camaraderie over their shared interest. Well, over time, maybe a couple months, whatever, there's a school dance that comes up, and that same dorky kid who was interested in her to begin with comes up to her and tries to get her to go out with him for the dance. Well, she says no because she's planning to ask her crush out. So when the crush finally comes over, she goes to ask him, and this is where you get somewhat of a pivotal moment for her character. He says no, he was planning to go with the same bully that had been bullying Jennifer this whole time. And she gets angry with this, but rather than just get angry, she then makes this very well-reasoned, lawyer-like argument about all the problems with his decision and how she's stupid, she doesn't understand the same references that they do, they don't have anything in common, and really he's just being shallow and looking at her for how she looks, rather than what's deeper and actually wanting a relationship. And he goes through this whole thing, but of course it goes over his head because he's just a teenage boy, and he walks away. Then right after, Bruce comes over with a present for her, not knowing what happened, but in the earlier montage it had been set up that they're both studying to take their SATs at some point. So she really wanted this expensive SAT book to help them study, but she didn't have enough money for it. So he comes in and gives her this, and they both end up studying. And it's this moment where you can see this connection of something real, of someone who knows each other and who are choosing each other to spend time with each other for who they are, for their common interests, for their relationship, over just the shallow things like the boy from before. Well, meanwhile, that same dorky boy who had asked her out is all by himself at home, having no one to go to the dance. I'd want this scene just to be a quiet, emotional moment where we get to see how lonely he is, in contrast with the connection that She-Hulk has built with Bruce. And Bruce and her together are studying, and even though she's sad at being rejected, still she has that connection with someone who really understands her and was willing to do something as sweet as getting the present for her like he did, while the dorky boy on the other hand didn't have anyone. In the next scene, She-Hulk and Bruce both graduate and get separate offers for schools in different parts of the United States. So they both have this heartfelt goodbye, and in that time, Jennifer gives him a really heartfelt present that was set up in a previous montage. Maybe it's one of the character cards from a board game, something like that, but something that you can tell means a lot to Bruce. So we have that heartfelt goodbye, and they both split up and go to college. Meanwhile, we see the younger dorky kid leave their graduation early and just disappear. Jennifer then ends up going to college, and on her first day, a group of girls that look like the same type of girls who are bullying her all throughout high school come up to her table and start to mock her. Well, then Nikki, her future best friend, comes up to them and tells them to go F themselves or uses some witty comment to make them go away. And she then looks at Jennifer and says, "This isn't high school anymore. It's time to grow a pair." And the end credit montage, or the thing that's on the side while the credits roll, during that time you can see how Jennifer and her both work together. Jennifer helps to teach her how to study better and to get better grades, while Nikki helps to teach her confidence. And during the last credit scene, the after credit scene, she looks at the camera and says, "I'm Jennifer Walters," and then it cuts to black. I know I spent a lot of time just on that first episode, but I really wanted to set up some core things. First, I wanted to set up the idea of perception, of course, like we've talked about before, when it comes to how she's bullied for how she appears, and for her being more nerdy, and also setting up that POV shot, which I think does a good job of symbolically showing the problem of perception, of being seen as just what you are on the outside. I also, at the same time, really want to show the connection between Bruce and Jennifer, and also how the importance of showing someone who you really are is in contrast to the dorky kid earlier, and I'm going to show how he's set up as something bigger in the future. But I think these set up some very core things when it comes to She-Hulk and her character. That at her core, she's really just a nerdy, dorky character who likes obscure literature references and history and really enjoys debating those things, and that's something that she enjoys. And she's also into this random board game, and she still likes it. Later on in the show, we'll hit back on that. How this version of her, the more complete version of who she is something that many people, men and other women, don't accept as the version of femininity or as the version of womanhood that she feels like she should be. Now, to hit on the rest of the show very quickly, I think there are going to be some big changes that we'll make with the rest of the show, but mostly we're going to stick to the same bones. The biggest change was just that first episode and trying to set up who she is and some of the core elements. But I think as the show progresses, some of the big things we want to change is, rather than getting the lawyer job because she was She-Hulk, instead, I want it to be because she defended Bruce. I think that she should keep her secret identity because it shows that she's still struggling with the acceptance of this secret identity, and she can't really accept that she's not Jennifer anymore. So she still gets her powers in the same way as the TV show, but instead, she doesn't show that to the rest of the world. She doesn't even show that to her friends. So the reason she gets this superhero lawyer job isn't because of her superpowers, but instead because she did such a good job defending Bruce in some way. So he could have, I don't know, stepped on a cat for all we care. But she did such a good job defending him that everyone wants her to work as their superhero defender. Meanwhile, she starts being targeted online for some reason she doesn't understand, and this starts to ramp up, and there's weird occurrences when it comes to villains and her being targeted. And so she starts to investigate what's going on, and that's when she uses She-Hulk at night to start investigating some things that are happening that seem mysterious around her. And with this, starts coming more and more about intelligentsia as the episodes progress. So partly there's this mystery element of what's going on, why is she being targeted, and what are all these new things with intelligentsia, and one evidence leads to another, and so at night, she investigates these things, and she gets caught on camera, and then eventually named by the media, and you get a lot of the same types of scenes, where the media is bad-mouthing her, talking about all the terrible things that she's been doing at night, when it comes to crime fighting, or just investigating things, and the people that she ends up going out with, all these different men, still have the same ideas about She-Hulk because she becomes this new rage. And we'll say maybe because the only thing that fits her is spandex. And so because of that, the revealing photos that have gone up on the internet end up tantalizing all these different men, so everyone becomes obsessed with her because she's this ideal version of a woman when she is in her She-Hulk form. This brings me to her dating life, where instead of what it was in the show, I want it more to be about her wanting to find a partner who is really interested in her for who she is, who wants to be there for Jennifer, and isn't there for this short-term hookup. But instead, while on these dates, everyone seems very short-term focused. But more than that, they keep bringing up She-Hulk during their conversation. So no matter where she goes, she cannot avoid She-Hulk. It has this somewhat feminized version of Spider-Man and how he can't avoid it either. And so during these conversations, she still has the same feeling of never really being seen until she goes out with one person who actually seems to genuinely be interested in her. However, he's younger than her, he seems really dorky and somewhat socially awkward, and of course he lives at home, and his job is all from home. He doesn't even have a car or a driver's license, so she just kind of ignores him and blows him off, even though they were the ones who had the deepest conversation. During this time, a lot of the same story beats play out as the show. A lot of the same courtroom scenes and issues play out. However, a lot of the extraneous things, though, the background characters and the extra stuff, that's given to She-Hulk to show how much she's struggling with her secret identity, how much she's struggling with the fact that she wants to be seen more for who she really is. She wants to show Nikki, for instance, her best friend, that she is in fact She-Hulk. That's who she is at night, and yet there's something within her that stops her from showing who she is. So we get to see a little bit behind the curtain of what's going on. At the same time, you get to also see some of the more idiosyncratic parts of her, like how maybe she goes to a weekly board game meeting with a lot of her friends, and that's when she talks about some of the issues with She-Hulk in this coded language, similar to how Stranger Things talks about D&D characters when it comes to whatever monster they're fighting. And so she uses the same coded language to somewhat talk about the things she's struggling with. So we get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain for who She-Hulk really is and all of the extra scenes that we've deleted from those secondary characters. Then the wedding scene plays out, and the difference with this, though, is that rather than stealing the spotlight, she ends up just being Jennifer and feeling like she's in the background of someone else's big day and not feeling like she ever gets a chance to have what they have. That's when she meets the same guy that she meets in the show. They start hooking up and going out, and then of course he leaves. So it plays out very similarly. Then she goes to her therapy session, and unlike what happens there, she really opens up more and gives us more of a peek into who she is and what she really wants, rather than what we had in the show. However, it still happens in a very similar way. But then we finally get to the dinner, and this is where something really changes. Rather than intelligentsia exposing her for having sex with some random dude, instead, it's more about them exposing her secret identity, because no one else knows. And this leads to a big blow-up, where she does end up destroying a lot of property, but rather than just framing it like, oh, She-Hulk is having a tantrum, like I feel the show did, instead, in our version, what she does is really Hulk out and rage out in a way that does seem like it threatens lives, that does seem like it's monumental, like she could really hurt people. And then she gets incarcerated. Now before this, since she had that encounter with the guy at night, her last encounter with him, she seems to have been getting a little bit weaker, a little more shaky. And then finally, when she's in the prison cell, we get to see that she's struggling even more. Maybe she starts having a tremor, or she starts getting really bad headaches, but something like that. So then Nikki and Abomination come in, and they break her out, saying that they have new leads, and they think they know where Intelligentsia's headquarters are. So she gets out, and she finally goes to confront Intelligentsia. So then She-Hulk makes her way to the headquarters. But before she goes, she tells Abomination and she tells Nikki that she doesn't want to go with anyone else because she doesn't want Nikki to be hurt or Abomination to lose his privileges. So then she makes her way inside, and it turns out to be her old high school. And it's revealed that the same dorky kid who had asked her out has been behind Intelligentsia this whole time. And he was also the same person to set up She-Hulk from the beginning by trying to take Hulk's powers with the accident. So he's the one who sabotaged their car and drove them off the road so he could take the powers for themselves, because all of the anger at society, at how he'd been treated, at how he'd been perceived by other people, had drove him to the point where he wanted to use his anger as a weapon, just like Hulk. Not to mention, he was also the same person who went on a date with She-Hulk earlier, who went on a date with Jennifer and actually showed interest. But even though he was the one who showed the most interest, and who, from a personality standpoint, she actually vibed with the most, still, he was rejected based upon how he appeared, based upon the shallow details. So this frames She-Hulk as the hypocrite in the situation, as someone who is guilty of all the problems that she's been having with other people this whole time. So after this happens, they then get in this fight, and when this fight happens, it's revealed that when the wedding person infiltrated her, or whatever you want to call it, when the spy ended up sleeping with her at night, he also drugged her in addition to taking away her DNA. So she's weaker, much weaker than she had been in the past because of this. So she ends up losing, and when she's losing, she looks at the camera and says something like, well, look at this, isn't this contrived? And then she ends up having the same sequence, just like before, where she comes out of the Disney menu, she ends up confronting the writers, and then we get some interesting scenes where she rewinds it and looks back at her childhood, and looks back at the ways he was treated from his perspective, instead of just looking at it through her narrow POV, like the beginning, like we made a point of doing at the beginning. Instead, she uses Kevin and the ability of the writers to look at it from his perspective, and to understand what he was going through. And as she does this, she realizes that she had been in the wrong too. How she had judged other people in a very shallow way. And she remembers back to when she looked at all the different dating profiles, and how all she did was look at the surface level details, and how she had done this, frankly, a great deal throughout her time, and had even done this with herself, with how she was as She-Hulk, and how she didn't accept that not only was she Jennifer, but she was also She-Hulk. Furthermore, what this also does, and this is the next big point, is that she looks at how her life differed from his. And the big difference was that she had people in her life, people that she talked to. She had Bruce. During that same moment at the first episode, when he was all alone during the dance, she had Bruce. She always had friends who she confided in. But yet, recently, she had pushed them away because she didn't want to show who she really was. She didn't want to come clean as She-Hulk. And so she realizes one of the big differences was her friendships and relationships, and opening up, being vulnerable and open with who she really was. So she then uses the power of the writers and Kevin to summon Abomination and Hulk to come and help her. And she says, I really need your help. So they all team up and stop him together. And once he's stopped, he's taken into custody, and she's exonerated because it's shown that she was drugged and then she was set up, etc. However, in mine, there's one more episode. In this last episode, you get to see how she's changed. She comes clean to Nikki and to Bruce, tells them what she's been going through and who she really is and how things have changed. And then she comes out to all of the media. She has a big press conference, and she owns the fact that she is She-Hulk, very reminiscent of Iron Man in the first Iron Man saying, I am Iron Man. She says, I am She-Hulk. But then the next thing she does is she takes the villain as her next client. She takes Intelligentsia and then tries to defend him in a court of law. And towards the end of the show, we get to see some really interesting scenes between Intelligentsia and She-Hulk. And they get a chance to really understand each other a bit more. For She-Hulk to show to the audience that she really has changed, and she really has understood the greater lessons of accepting who you are and accepting other people, and how that is somewhat of the antidote to this problem of perception. This has been the Bird's Eye View. I hope this series has done a good job of understanding and improving the message of She-Hulk. I would really like to know your thoughts down below, particularly about the rewrite. Did I do a good job improving the message? Or how would you have changed it and made it better? You're welcome for the video, and I'll see you in the next one.